Hey everyone, Owen here, and today we're going to be talking about, among other things, David Hume, Team Fortress 2, Shakespeare, Paladins, Ovid, and, of course, Overwatch. But above all else, the concept of originality. Now, considering the title, I know a lot of you are here for Overwatch. That is, of course, if you're not here for the obvious sex appeal clickbait of David Hume in the thumbnail, am I right, people? But, to measure your expectations, today at least, we won't be talking about Overwatch as a world, story, or political statement. That's an incredibly interesting subject, but one for another time. We won't even really be discussing the, game part of the game, be that any of its numerous characters and their abilities or appearances, its art style or locales, or even its most basic gameplay mechanics. This video isn't really about whether or not Overwatch is actually derivative of other titles. While this video focuses on this specific game and those surrounding it, the purpose of this framing is to use the game to make a broader point about all of our concepts of originality, and how I think, using empiricist philosopher David Hume as a reference, they're kinda meaningless. Originality has pretty much always been an important part of how we talk about games, as is the case for almost any art we try to criticize, even if we don't always characterize it as such. We compare one game to another that preceded it, to previous games in the same franchise, others in the same genre, in order to make points about certain aspects of it, be that plot, gameplay, concept, or anything else someone might want to analyze. And to begin, I want to make very clear that I'm not saying this is bad. Comparison is one of the only, if not the main ways we think about anything, much less art. In fact, that's one of my main points in this video. My argument here isn't that concepts of originality and derivation are completely useless in any context, even for criticism. Sure, in some cases I think their invocation is unfounded, and I'll talk about this soon, but my thesis is rather that they are only aspects of the actual issues we have with certain games, and that invoking them exclusively not only represents a misjudgment of the actual value originality holds, but actually hurts games in the process. So, enough dancing around the point. It's time to talk about Overwatch. In 2016, nearly a year and a half after first announcing it, Blizzard Entertainment officially released their so-called FPS MOBA, Overwatch. It was met with immediate critical acclaim, and the futuristic character shooter developed a robust playership and equally dedicated fanbase very quickly. The game was based around a roster of unique characters, called heroes, despite varying moral alignment, from whom groups of 6 players could choose to build a team to battle over various objectives, such as point control, pushing a payload, or a hybrid of the two. The wide range of playstyles provided by the variety of characters made the game very accessible to a wide range of players, contributing to the game's success. But with success and acclaim also came criticism, and one of the primary criticisms present in online discourse around the release was that Overwatch was highly derivative, even to some a rip-off, of Valve's 2007 title, Team Fortress 2. This idea fundamentally hinged upon the perception that the games, in their focus around unique characters with associated abilities, some of which were close in function between the two titles, and similar objective-based gameplay, were close enough in overall concept to suggest that Overwatch had some way stolen from Team Fortress. But let's step back from video games for a moment, and go back a little. 393 years back, to be exact. In 1623, presumably a year or two after he announced it at E3, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was written. But if modern video game YouTubers had been around then, they might have pointed out that, in terms of concept and story, Shakespeare was about 1,615 years late to the party. In 8 AD, the Roman poet Ovid's magnum opus, Metamorphoses, was written, and while it included many different stories, the one we're interested in now is one by the name of Pyramus and Thisbe. In this story, 2 lovers, Pyramus and Thisbe, are forbidden from seeing each other on account of a bitter rivalry between their parents, and are left with a crack in a wall as their only means of communication. Eventually, their isolation from each other is too much to bear, and they plot to meet each other at an ancient tomb outside of the city. When the time comes, Thisbe arrives first, but encounters a lion. While she escapes this encounter, she leaves behind a garment of clothing, which Pyramus finds upon his arrival. Assuming the worst, Pyramus ends his own life in despair. When Thisbe returns to the scene, she finds Pyramus's body and follows suit, using Pyramus's sword. Now, I bring all of this up because I think it's a good, fairly simple way to communicate an idea. Originality is a quality-neutral term. That is to say, how original something is in no way inherently linked to how good it is. Here we have Romeo and Juliet, one of the most classic stories ever, which is highly derivative. This, of course, not even to mention the countless works based heavily on Shakespeare's that are considered great in their own right. Sure, Shakespeare and Ovid's works aren't the exact same, but neither are Overwatch and Team Fortress 2. But even Ovid's works didn't spring out of nothing fully formed, so where did Ovid come from? Well, he came from the stories before him, and the stories before those, and the stories before those, and from observations and aspects of life before those. Of course, that's a grossly oversimplified description of how those kinds of things work, but it's meant to illustrate the fact that ideas never just appear, everything is cumulative. In the history of the Earth, cells don't suddenly jump to people. There is a slow buildup of development, and stories and ideas work in the same evolutionary manner. This idea in itself kind of undermines the idea of some pure originality because it acknowledges that it's impossible to have any ideas without previous ones to build upon. No one ever went from making the first wooden tool to making a Swiss Army knife overnight. And while some people might be thinking that the idea of star-crossed lovers and the team-based hero shooter aren't necessarily equatable, I would say that, and I think the person we're about to talk about would agree, the distinction doesn't really matter. In 1748, an inquiry concerning human understanding was published. It was written by then 37-year-old David Hume, an empiricist and skeptic philosopher from Scotland, and fundamentally, it is meant to challenge our perceptions about where ideas come from, and the infallibility of ideas themselves. Back then, and even today in philosophy, skeptic didn't mean someone who got mad about women being in video games. It means someone who ascribes to the philosophy that certainty is impossible. Hume's central point in the book is that knowledge is not quite as perfect as we think it is, and that even lines of apparent logic and reasoning are really just a set of inferences. Even though we might be able to study any given set of things to infinity, no matter how perfect that study, we will never actually be able to draw lines of causality or reaction without inference. But what we're interested in this book is a passage in section 2 on the origin of ideas. Here Hume says, "Though our thought seems to possess this unbounded liberty, we shall find, upon a nearer examination, that it is really confined within very narrow limits, and that all this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded to us by sense and experience." He then goes on to present an elaboration on this idea, saying, "When we think of a golden mountain, we only join two consistent ideas, gold and mountain, with which we are acquainted. All our ideas or more feeble perceptions are copies of our impressions or more lively ones." These ideas that Hume presents almost completely undercut the concept of originality once again. While Overwatch and even Romeo and Juliet are more complex than a golden mountain, the same basic principle applies in those cases, just compounded many times over. If our only capabilities for originality consist of our ability to expand upon and edit already known ideas, then how can use of the ideas of others be on its own either indicative of quality or lack or presence of originality? The complexity of an idea doesn't matter, since the most complex idea is no more original than the most basic. Hume's work posits the idea that any idea we might have of varying degrees of originality actually falls within a very narrow and arguably inconsequential range of possibilities, be that idea as complex as Overwatch or as simple as a golden mountain. So, by looking at the work of David Hume, we encountered the idea that originality, in the case of Team Fortress 2, Romeo and Juliet, Overwatch, and Pyramus and Thisbe at least, doesn't really matter. But there's something important about those works that I didn't really touch on then. They're all good. Let me explain what I mean by that. I don't really mean that they're high-quality entertainment per se. That's a pretty subjective thing, and to be honest, I'm not really concerned with determining whether something is or not. What I mean by that, specifically in the cases of Overwatch and Romeo and Juliet, they are not made in order to replicate their predecessors exactly. To demonstrate what I mean, let's take a bit of a deep dive into the fascinating world of Overwatch ripoffs. If there's anything that can tell you pretty definitively that something is prolific, it's that there exists an entire YouTube video genre based around it, and none of them are quite about the same thing. Heroic Mission, Legend of Titan, and Paladins are just some of the names often brought up when the idea of Overwatch ripoffs are mentioned, and all of these receive their fair share of discussion and mockery online, depending on the perceived level of derivation. Now, I can already tell certain people will be thinking that some of these alleged copies are not equivalent to the others in their degree of copying, but before you go too far down that line of thinking, let's remember what we talked about with David Hume, the idea that originality is basically a made-up concept. Some people might say that there are still varying degrees of originality, but I honestly still don't think it even matters when we criticize ripoffs. That's because I don't really think that we think that these things are bad or worthy of criticism because of their lack of originality, and something that kind of reveals this to me is a term often used interchangeably with ripoff: cash grab. This to me reveals the actual underlying issue at play here, a perception that the ripoff is meant to emulate success and to reap financial benefit, presumably at the cost of whoever created the original. The claim of lack of originality is only meaningful within the context of this financial benefit to the apparent thieves, or the financial losses to the original creators. Usually associated with these quote-unquote cash grab products is also a low quality and poor gameplay experience, but again, this is a criticism on its own, not something inherently linked to originality. I have a thought experiment for you. Try, just for yourself in your mind, to explain why an Overwatch ripoff of your choice is bad, without invoking anything other than originality itself. I've thought about this myself, and to be perfectly honest, I can't. And I don't mean for this to imply that these other things aren't bad, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but what I mean to say is that originality on its own, whether it is perceived to be present or not, cannot have any goodness or badness assigned to it without outside context. We don't hate Overwatch clones for their closeness and style on its own, we hate them because of the financial implications of that closeness. If we look outside of Overwatch to Electronic Arts and their annual sports series FIFA, often maligned for unoriginality between its installments, we dislike it because of a perceived scamming of the consumer by selling a minimally changed product year after year. Once again, this unoriginality is only given a degree of morality contextually because the creators of the unoriginal art are perceived to be doing something out of a desire for profit acquired in a way we have decided is dishonest. And I'd like to raise the point that, if you'll notice, we don't really talk about Overwatch as a ripoff so much anymore. I'd argue this is because the game was, well, good and emulated its predecessor well. Once again, our opinion of it is linked to our perception of its quality. At this point, you might be wondering, oh, if I'm not actually going to go on and speculate about the correctness of these contextual labelings of badness, what is this section even about? But for the next section, in order to talk about how our misunderstanding of originality actually hurts games, it was necessary to fully divorce the idea of originality and the idea of morality. And, conveniently, that brings us to the next section. So, we've established the problems in how we think about concepts of originality already, and as a philosophical idea, that's all well and good. But I'd like to go a step further and explain how I think these ideas and attitudes hurt games, and even art in general. Now, I'm not going to make any claims about whether or not this actually directly affects artists in the game industry or elsewhere negatively. I don't know the answer there, and it's difficult, if not impossible, for anyone to really accurately make a broad claim about this one way or another. But what I do know is that these ideas affect how we view, consume, and criticize games, and those criticisms affect games. Criticizing games exclusively for being similar or derivative in some aspect creates an environment in which developers are discouraged from expanding on existing ideas. And while it's true, as we earlier discussed, that not doing that is actually impossible, the point remains that this keeps us from potentially great games and art simply because they are arbitrarily singled out as unoriginal. The only way that our favorite genres, styles, and gameplay mechanics improve is iteration, and discouraging it only serves to hurt these things. Overwatch significantly expanded upon and experimented with the foundation created by Team Fortress 2, which borrowed many ideas from Quake before it, and which in turn was an expansion on Doom and other early first-person shooters. None of these would have been possible without the games, but more importantly the ideas that preceded them, and it's only by that process of evolution and iteration that they improved in the way they did. Love or hate Overwatch, it's impossible to deny the fact that it is an amalgamation of ideas from many different games, times, and even genres, as any piece of art is. Even if you do hate it, the game is just another step on the ever-evolving path of the medium, providing future developers and artists the resources to continue their expansion of ideas. No matter how much some people might hate the idea, if Team Fortress 3 is ever made, it'll probably take a lot of ideas from Overwatch, or at least, considering Overwatch's massive success, Valve would be smart to. That's just how art works. There's no ultimate end goal, just an infinite number of steps in the course of an infinite evolutionary tree. And in order to let that play out, it's important that, well, we don't needlessly stifle it. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think that anything is justifiable in the name of letting evolution of art play out, nor should that be used as a defense against any criticism. Criticism is a deeply integral part of that evolution, and so trying to stop it would be just as bad as I think that our current ideas about originality are. What I mean by it is that we should try to be more critical of our own criticisms, and level them in specific ways, thinking more about what we actually mean by them. When we complain about originality, that's not really what we mean, which means that, oftentimes, our problems aren't really addressed by an attempt to respond to that criticism. If we take issue with low quality or rushed games, we should talk about that, say what mechanics are problematic, say where the game falls short. If our problem is in a perceived malicious attempt to cut someone's profits, then we ought to say so. And on that point, I'll note that maybe we should be paying more attention to the conditions for and treatment of the developers making those games than we are with the game's marginal effects on corporate profits. But regardless, these specific criticisms are as important to the art as our resistance to inaccurately attributed criticisms are. We need to keep questioning both our art and ourselves in order to more perfectly describe what we see and take issue with in the world. Most importantly, I think it would do us all well to try and be a bit of a skeptic every now and then.